So we've learned a lot about lynchings nationwide, and we just wanted to know, what did that look like locally? What has been the impact? And what do we do with it today? And I wanted to share with you just a brief quote from this wonderful book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, that talks about, in some depth, I think, why this really, really matters to Christians in particular. So I'm just reading a paragraph, and then Brittany will take over. I didn't mention she's not only a teacher, she's also an activist and a preacher, right? Yeah. So here's the quote. As Jesus was an innocent victim of mob hysteria and Roman imperial violence, many African Americans were innocent victims of white mobs, thirsting for blood in the name of God and in defense of segregation, white supremacy, and the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race. Both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, instruments of torture and execution, reserved primarily for slaves, criminals, and insurrectionists, the lowest of the low in society. Both Jesus and blacks were publicly humiliated, subjected to the utmost indignity and cruelty. They were stripped in order to be deprived of dignity, then paraded, mocked and whipped, pierced, derided and spat upon, tortured for hours in the presence of jeering crowds for popular entertainment. In both cases, the purpose was to strike terror in the subject community. It was to let people know that the same thing would happen to them if they did not stay in their place. So, if this sounds and looks a lot like Good Friday, there's a reason. So, Teacher Wade, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Good evening. I'm so happy to be with you all. I am Brittany Paschall, as Thomas mentioned. Yes, I was trying to think of your last name. I was like Reverend is it Kleinert? Yes. So happy to be here with you all, and to be among kin. I came up in a Stone Campbell tradition, and so I came up Church of Christ, so distant cousins. Or maybe siblings, depending on, so I'm just happy to be here. That said, want to start and just kind of root us in the land we're on. We're on Cherokee land, Kusawati Cherokee land. So I just want to acknowledge that. That's important to me as someone who is not only a Black American, but someone who also has indigenous roots. So I just want to name the land that we're on. It is also International Women's Day, and so I'm also always intentional about naming my lineage, but it feels pertinent to name the lineage of women that I come from. So I'd like to offer the names of my grandmothers, Sarah and Doris, who are resting now with the cloud of witnesses, and my mother and my aunt, Delta and Gilda. My mother, who desegregated Hillwood High School and Westmead Elementary School, and who taught in Metro Nashville Public Schools for 33 years. So I just lift those names among the long line of women that I come from. So about housekeeping, feel free to move about the room. Like if you need to take a break or go out, that won't bother me, please do so. If I sit at some time, I'm a chronically ill person, and so at some point in this presentation, I may sit down, I may take care of myself. I invite you to do the same in whatever the way that looks for you. What else did I want to say? So ask questions, and then I will use an attention. So the way that I like to so there'll be some talking that I'll have you do at your tables or with people around you. And the way that I will get your attention back is through a West African call called I go and I may. So everybody say I go, and everybody say I may. All right, and so this is a very collective call and response. That means anybody in the community can use it. It simply means this. I go means I need you to listen. I may means we are listening. So if I say I go, the response is I may. I go? All right, so that's what I'll do to get your attention. Any questions for me before I kind of talk about who I am and how I ended up here. Okay, so I don't have a clicker, so I'm going to be moving about a bit. And the first thing I want to talk about is who We Remember is, and this idea of We Remember Nashville. And then I'll play a video that'll talk a little bit more about my lineage and who I am and how I come to this work. But before even I talk about the work of We Remember, I will say this. I have bios and people that introduce me, and I'm always, as Thomas said, you know, I live in a very intersectional place. I am a licensed minister in the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which was the denomination of King, and that's important for me to lift. So it's the denomination that when King was kicked out of the National Baptist Convention, he went to the Progressive National Baptist Church. I am a teacher, right? That is my primary work. And my students and the families I serve are in the schools that I went to are my primary constituents, and I'm really, really clear about that. And I am also an organizer. I spent a significant amount of time, became a youth organizer at the age of 16, working actually here in Nashville around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also transit and just youth voice. Organized all the way through college, did some work on my campus. I went to private Christian school. That's another talk. And I went to a PWI, also another talk. And then I was a freshman in college when Mike Brown was murdered. I was the only black girl in my sociology class, the only black girl in my Christian studies class. And the week Mike Brown was murdered, in one of my classes, we had a conversation about slavery and what slavery was about. And one of my classmates says that it was about economics. And I said, well, hey, what? That's not untrue, right? But who was the product? Who was the product of that? And who labored for that? And so I come bringing those experiences, but I'm also a daughter and a friend and a foodie. And so this work for me is my life's work in some iteration. I've been doing it before I started We Remember Nashville. In late 2018, at the time, I worked for a youth theology initiative, and we took our young people on a trip to Montgomery that was a part of a larger trip around the civil rights movement. I was teaching a course at the time that was around narrative and racial identity formation, which what we know about racial identity formation is that it happens and it starts earlier than we think. And the National Memorial for Peace and Justice had just opened. It was very new. And as I walked into the memorial, there's so many things about it. If you haven't been, you should go, and I'll talk more about the opportunity to do that. But I felt like I came up knowing history, right? I am the daughter of educators. I am very likely a descendant of Belle Meade Plantation, and particularly on my mother's side, we know a lot of our history. And that was in Afro-diasporic communities, oral history is a big deal. And my family was not an exception to this. And so when I say that, I also come to this work as a self-taught historian, as someone who values the ways in which our stories can be told that may not fit into the colonial idea of knowledge and the cultural reproduction of knowledge. So as I was at the Memorial for Peace and Justice, I'm like reading these names, and I'm like, I don't know these people. And I've organized in this city, and I fought for people's dignity and rights in this city and in the larger movement. And how do I not know this history? And so I got back on the bus. I texted a dear friend of mine who was back here in Nashville, who was also a Nashville native and a historian, and said, do you know this history? And this person was like, no. And I was like, well, this is really interesting. Started to interrogate that, and we formed We Remember Nashville, which is, we're a registered coalition with the Equal Justice Initiative. We are one of the first large metropolitan cities to have 2 markers that were sponsored in partnership with Equal Justice Initiative. I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that, but that's how the organization came to be. And so this video here that you're getting ready to see is a video that I recorded during my time as a fellow with the Encore organization, and they are an organization that works around this intergenerational social change and social healing. And so it's going to give you contextually a little bit about myself and then a little bit about the work of We Remember, what we've done and what we hope to do. And I think that it's really pertinent to ground us in this presentation tonight.
What, if anything, do memory and justice have to do with each other? In the summer of 2018, I began to face this question head on. As the daughter of a woman who desegregated schools, the great-great-great-granddaughter of enslaved people, and a veteran community organizer, I knew a little about memory, and I thought about justice. Yet, I found myself standing in the middle of Montgomery, Alabama, at the Equal Justice Initiative, beaming with curiosity. I stood there reading marker after marker of names I didn't know. Samuel Smith, Henry and Ephraim Grizzard. Eventually, I came to a marker with the names of victims of racial terror lynchings in Davidson County, where I lived, worked, and called home. Sadly, I didn't know those names either. I returned home determined not just to know these names, but to tell these stories in a way that connected our not so distant past to our present. The following fall, I founded We Remember Nashville, an interfaith, multi-generational coalition that exists to promote community awareness, education, and public reckoning around racial terror in Nashville. To date, we have installed 2 historical markers dedicated to 3 of the 9 known lynchings in our city. We have forged partnerships with important stakeholders like our Historical Commission, churches, and schools to tell the story of racial violence with truth and dignity. We've hosted events like our Week of Remembrance, educational forums, pilgrimages to EJI, and even interfaith worship services. But our work is far from over. The recent and modern day lynchings of people like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and even Daniel Hambrick and Jacquez Clemens, who were murdered right here in Nashville, just blocks from the site of previous racial terror lynchings, are a testament to this. But we are a young racial justice focused nonprofit, and many people still do not know about us or understand the vitality of our work. We are looking for in-kind donations of marketing services, accounting support, and branding expertise. In addition, we welcome support via monetary donations, following our social media outlets, and attending virtual events. With this kind of partnership, we could continue our work of telling this important story while inviting our broader community to take part in these meaningful acts of memory and justice. Ida B. Wells, a journalist and anti-lynching advocate, once stated, "The way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them." Memory and justice have everything to do with each other. I hope that you will join We Remember Nashville in continuing to forge this important connection for generations to come.
So yeah, that's a little bit about us. Let me say this. At the time of recording that video, you'll hear, so I'll say a couple things. EJI has a definition that they use for a mob lynching that is their requirements in order to be in their museum. And there are 2 primary definitions that historians and people in this work, people who do memory work, whatever you want to call them. One is the definition that we kind of see Ida B. Wells, who was a little bit, I would say, more broad in who she included in her work and in her narrative and in her storytelling, right? Then we also see the NAACP, which they consider a mob lynching to be one where 5 or more people were present. As we remember, we don't exactly have a set determination on what we determine a mob lynching or a racial terror lynching, but we lean more towards being more inclusive than less inclusive, and we lean more towards saying that we want to lift these names and we want to lift these stories. So I say that to say, at the time, we did anticipate having more markers. We've since decided on 4 phases. I'll talk to you about that. But it's well debated. We have some that in Nashville we know of 6. that are documented. We had a team of historians. So we know of 6. We have a possible 7th and 8th, but we are careful about, because of how political this work can be and how political this work is, we're careful about the number that we lift. So we know about 6, and you'll hear me talk about primarily about those. If you have questions about that, happy to answer them. But before we move on any further, were there any questions just off that video? Okay, so I wanted to do an activity, and you can engage this however you see fit. So if you have a phone or a cellular device, that's fine. If you have a pen and a piece of paper, that's also okay. But it's going to require you to record some things. So I'll give you a minute to get adjusted and prepare yourself for that. And for those of you who may watch this recording back, I'd invite you to also do this activity. So as you're doing that, just an overview of kind of how the rest of the evening will go. We will start with this activity, and then I'm going to talk about the work and what we've accomplished, and then also about the stories, and then about what we see down the line as our work, how that's evolved and how that's changed. And then I'll open it up for formal questions and answers, but you, like I said, stop me, ask me, say, Brittany, come here, at whatever. So this activity, right, We Remember Nashville, we sit in kind of an interesting intersection in the sense that our work is like public memory, and I'll talk about what that means, but it's also bigger than that. We are an interfaith, or our goal is to be interfaith, our goal is to be intergenerational, co-generational with our work, but at the core, we're always engaging this idea of memory. When we think about even the name of We Remember Nashville, that was the thing out of all our values. We have values around truth and values around resilience and values around remembrance, but memory was the thing we continue to come back to. And so I want us to take a minute to engage our memory and then to talk through that. And so this activity is going to ask you to do that. It's going to call upon some of your memory. And so I'm going to ask you several questions, and I just want you to number your answers to this, and then I'll ask you kind of what came up as we do this activity. All right, the first question is, and this activity is entitled, Do You Remember? So the first question, what is the name of your favorite teacher or mentor? If you just had to pick one teacher or mentor from all of your life, can be recent, past, what is the name of your favorite teacher or mentor? All right. Second question is, what is the name of your favorite place in Nashville or your hometown? What is the name of your favorite place in Nashville or your hometown where you spend the most amount of time, your community? What's your favorite place in your community? All right, what is the name of the best show that you've watched recently or book that you've read recently? Podcast, something you've engaged media-wise. What is the name of the best podcast? It can be a podcast, it can be some type of music. What's the best thing you've watched, read, or listened to recently? Next question is very similar. What is your favorite thing, just one, that you've ever watched, read, or listened to? Favorite thing that you've watched, read, or listened to, ever? Ever. Write the name of 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners. List 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners. Name the first Black woman to get a Pulitzer Prize. That's the next question. First Black woman to get a Pulitzer Prize. Next question is to list 5 Nashville mayors. 5 people who've been the mayor of Nashville. Yes. I know which one you're thinking about. There are no grades for this. I'm not even collecting it. This is an ungraded assignment. Should have said that. No pressure. All right, 5 Nashville mayors. List 5 Black elected officials in Davidson County, current. 5 Black people elected to public office in the city, or African American folks. List 5 historically Black businesses, landmarks, or institutions in Nashville. List 5 historically Black churches in Nashville. I'll give you a hint that one of the oldest is a sister congregation of Vine Street. It is, well, it's in North Nashville for sure. Yeah. Yep. 5 historically Black churches. Name 3 historically Black neighborhoods in Nashville. Name 3 Black-led organizations in Nashville. We Remember doesn't count. Three Black-led organizations in Nashville. I'd even take Middle Tennessee. Name 3 or more people lynched in Nashville or Davidson County. Name 2 or more Black people killed by the Metro Nashville Police in Davidson County. Give you just another minute or so to wrap up your list. All right, talk to me about this. What did you observe about that process in yourself, in the room, as you were making the list? What did you observe about that process? Just observation, not feelings, just observation.
First of all, I'm pretty just about one observation about myself. I'm ignorant.
What else did you observe?
My memory isn't what it used to be.
That's real. That's real. What else? What did you observe about even the questions? What was hard? What was easy? Which came faster?
Much harder to recall Black organizations, Black people.
Mhm. What else? Observationally, what was that like?
That's scary.
Enlightening.
Enlightening?
Yeah.
It was all about me.
Yeah. What else?
Well, like when you ask the question, I think, oh, I know that, and then I don't know any of it.
Yeah. Yeah. How did it feel to do this activity?
Depressing.
Humbling, depressing. What else?
Embarrassing.
To me, it felt like we live in our bubbles. And we have so much information around us all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like these are important questions, but I wasn't surprised that I didn't know the answers.
Yeah. Right.
If I may too, I also feel in my own observation of myself, I'm not originally from here. I've been here for years. However, I also am very much aware of how much news, if at all, given on certain material too. So it's not just the challenge of the ignorance as it is, how much of it is actually conveyed
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
the news has its opportunity. And generally, like anything, the powers that be, when they control a narrative and reinforce it with negative imagery, or none at all, or very little, or very quick and thin, most people are not able to gather that because the information A is either A, misinformed, B, not given at all, or C, given with a different perspective altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of feel the accumulation of that, along with just, again, not it being aware,
Yes.
being made aware.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Was it easier? Raise your hand if it was easier for you to think about things that were personal to you, like your favorite mentor, your favorite teacher.
Yeah.
Did y'all observe that? Or your favorite place, right? Why do you think that why do you think I had you do this? Because it wasn't just to torture you. Why do you think I had you do this? At the beginning of a conversation about lynching, memory.
I think you're trying to teach us that memory takes a lot of work.
Yeah. What else? I love that. Because before I really started, We Remember, at the time, two of my grandparents were still living, and they both had dementia. One had a much more progressive version than the other, and they were also the two primary storytellers in my life. And so it was, among other things, fascinating to watch the people who had gifted me these stories forget the stories. Right? And so, like you said, memory is work. Why else do you think I had you do this?
I think it's a point of jogging memory, yes, but also self-inventory. A moment to take in on oneself and say, how much of anything you do know, how much of it you want to know. And even with the ignorance of it not being readily given, how much of it are you able to go out and research? With Google at our hand now and even information always around us, most of it is hidden, if you will, when it comes to one race over another.
Absolutely.
You're not going to tell me who the first Pulitzer Prize winning was. I'm going to be picking it up in a minute.
Thought-provoking.
Yes. Do you want me to give you a hint? You want me to straight out to you?
Not Oprah.
Tennessee.
Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks. Yeah. What was the hardest question for you? What was the hardest question? Okay, names of the people lynched. Okay. Well, that's good. Good news. You're at a thing about lynching. So, good news.
Yeah, that's the name. I mean, assuming you meant neighborhoods and not didn't just say North Nashville or
Yeah. Yeah, neighborhoods. But North Nashville is a start, right? Because some people don't even know North Nashville, right? Yeah. that would say, you're right. You know, our city has changed a lot. And all of their stories, like why was South Nashville, right? 12 South would have been one I would have listed. My best friend is also a Black woman Nashville native, and so I called her and asked her all the questions to make sure that she was run off names, so that I wasn't like, okay, you're out of the league. And so raise your hand if it was easier for you to name the 5 mayors than it was to name the current council members. Was that
That's true.
or council members, or I said elected officials,
Yeah.
right? Because all the mayors of Nashville have been white. So, yeah, you know, you ask about Briley, I assume, right? Yeah, right? And we see that name, right? So our memory is triggered, right? Because we get on the freeway and we see Briley, right? So we also have had 2, right? And so, anyway, I wanted this to just activate, you know, memory is work, memory is living. And especially when we talk about public memory, it's a choice. What we remember is deeply connected, and this is not to indict. I don't believe in, it's not helpful for me to make people feel guilty. So there's lots of conversation around. I was actually on CBS a few years ago talking about this critical race theory thing and all this, as a former diversity, equity, and inclusion educator, I don't need anybody to feel guilty. I need people to move their feet. So I'm never doing anything to indict people, but what we remember is a choice to a certain extent, right? And it's deeply personal, but also very communal. So when we think about memory, public memory, which is really the realm that We Remember finds ourselves in, I've looked at so many definitions of public memory, and tomorrow I may not like this one, but I like this one today. And I liked it because of the language of choice, right? This idea that public memory is the ongoing choice, right? And I would say the ongoing choice of across generations. There's other language that I would add to this, but in this particular definition, when we talk about public memory, we're talking about the ongoing choices that a people group makes. And this person is doing much more macro work, and so speaks of a nation, but a city can make this, a community can make this choice to remember a particular part. So it's specific. It's a particular part of history. And it is highlighting that history within a container. It is like saying, hey, this thing happened, and we, not Brittany acknowledges it, right? Or Thomas acknowledges it, but we acknowledge that this thing happened. And it's done in a way that even people who may not be standing saying we acknowledge it have to see it. And that's the hard part. And that's done in a social, cultural, and political context, right? And I think that the context and the approach are things that are very important to us as we remember. How do we tell the stories of lynching in a way that humanizes people? How do we do it in the dignifying ways? How do we tell it when families are like, I don't want this to be told? When our sister coalitions in Jackson, Tennessee have people even who are African American who say, this is not a history that is comfortable. We are just here locally, we've been in over a year-long battle about the next marker that we're putting up, right? So what does it mean to remember? How do we do it, and how do we do it well? Those are ongoing questions, but this is at the core what public memory is. I would like to say that we do public memory work, but we like to think that we do sacred public memory work, and that's something that is personal to me and my approach, but that is to say that it's a stretch beyond public memory for the sake of doing it. It's saying that even from an interfaith perspective, we believe that this work is connected to something larger than us. That the way that we remember people and the way that we don't, or events, the way that we remember and the way we forget is larger than just that. That there are bodies and spirits and livelihoods tied to the act of remembrance, right? So it's not woo-woo when we say sacred public memory. If you hear me drop that, it's really to, and this is something that I came to as someone who was on the front lines of movement work and then who transitioned. After I was on the front lines of movement work, I transitioned to more of a chaplaincy role within the movement. And something that we often got trying to be tactful in how I say this. We were often really good at demanding what we needed, right? And that is part of it. But at the core of all the work I've ever done has been about human dignity, right? It's about things like lynching demoralize people, demoralize communities. And church folks were at these lynchings. Church folks were promoting these lynchings. One of our markers that we're working on putting up, the last time I was out, the tree, we know the tree that Samuel Smith was lynched from, it's still there. Even in recent years when we've been out at the site, people have driven by and said, I remember the day that it happened. My uncle came and put me in the car to go to it, right? And another reason that I say sacred public memory is because so often, and I'm speaking as a Christian myself or as someone who follows Jesus, that we like to sometimes separate the sacred from it. But church folks were at lynchings. Church folks were lynching people. And so we have to be accountable in that way as well, wherever our faith tradition or non-faith tradition is. That these were like people with lives and stories. Questions?
In Western Kentucky, they've done a study. Dr. Turley, and you may have read her book, The Gospel of Freedom. She just wrote it. I know Alistine well. She says that the Baptists, the Masons, the Democrats, and the Freedom Riders did the majority of the lynchings in West Kentucky.
Riders are not riders.
Night riders. The backboards. And we were at a Baptist church, and you could just see backs boned up because it was a generational church, and it was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah,
So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it ironically or not, the property is now owned by a church, Samuel Smith, and it's been really interesting to talk with faith communities about involvement or non-involvement. And because it's open and this is being recorded, I won't say much more about that. But I will say, it's been interesting talking to people of faith who are like, let's forget, right? When our whole faith, I would argue, is built on remembrance. A lot of it is, right? You just read Combe, right? Who is, the story of Jesus is historical as well as it's theology, right? And it's a lot of things, and historical is one of them. So yeah, I'll move on from this. So let's talk about kind of how we've attacked our work in the past, and then I'll talk about how we're kind of attacking it. I mentioned that I've been on fellowship the last several years to Thomas, and so I've been on fellowship thinking about hey, we started this thing in 2018, and it was a very different time. And since then, we've had a global pandemic. We've also had just a lot of other things happening, and I've been asking as a founder of an organization, how are we best positioned? What is our work, and how we started out and we were heavy on because we want to do our work well. I don't think that with this type of work there's ever a complete story, but it matters to me that we tell the most complete one that we can, with the expectation that 10 years or 5 or 7 years from now, someone who may or may not be Brittany will come and revise it. Not revise the history, but to say we know more now. And this means something to us, and that community will reckon with that, and that will be an ongoing body of work. So it's important for me to start there. But when we started, we remember I was hyper focused on our work being local. So EJI, who is a great partner to us in our work, had a plethora of research that they'd already gathered. And at the time, they had 4 or 5 of the lynchings listed on their marker. We discovered an additional one. We gathered a team of historians we partnered with the Metro Historical Commission with Dr. Lee Williams over at Tennessee State University, professor of public history. And they formed a team of historians and community members, and we did primary source research on every lynching that we could find that occurred in Davidson County proper. That was done by We Remember community members and by historians. So, because I wanted to say that Nashville people had verified the work. That was important to me. It wasn't enough for us to say that historians that had no roots here, and this is me being a Nashville native and me just the way I approach my work as a community organizer, place matters and people matter. And so we had a team that spent months writing language for our proposed markers and gathering primary source documents. We then went to EJI with some corrections. They published those since. And we, at the time, had a 4-phase project. And so that's what you're seeing up here now. The first phase is complete. We completed it in the summer of 2019. And so that first phase highlights 4 of the known lynchings that we know of, right? We started with this phase, just as a note, because it was the most public, current place, right? This is not necessarily the lynching had the most people attended. That's not what we're arguing. But the foot traffic down, it's off Public Square, off Bank Street. We wanted to put our first 2 markers in a strategic place. And quite honestly, just from a founder's perspective, in the least controversial place, right? Nobody came for us putting a marker in Public Square. They just didn't. It is, it's also just a fun fact. We positioned our markers at a particular distance from at a particular angle. You can see the water in a particular way. And that is a ode to Afro-diasporic people and what what water means to us as a people. So we have 2 markers. One is on First Avenue and Bank. One is, and if you go up the hill, you're going to go towards the Woodland Street Bridge, which was at the time a suspension bridge. We have another marker there. I'll talk more about the stories of these particular lynchings, but they were both, the jail used to be right off of Bank Street. Well, kind of where the courthouse is now, the jail used to be there. And so they were dragged from the jail and lynched on Woodland Street Bridge. So we have our first phase. We completed that in 2019. We had a week of remembrance. And then we kind of took a significant pause. I got a fellowship. I said, I'm going to go and research and kind of think about the models and talk to other people doing similar work. But we didn't pause. We started to pursue our marker for Samuel Smith, and that we're hoping and praying and willing and all the things that you can do that in 2023. So you've noticed we've kind of skipped a phase, right? There was some interest about Samuel Smith in the Nolensville area, and so we were like, let's go where the community is really interested in doing this work. However, like I said, this has been a really tedious process. Several community meetings. It has passed through the Historical Commission. So we will have a marker for Samuel Smith. It's a matter of when and a matter of bringing the community alongside us. So Samuel Smith was lynched, that's the tree I was telling you. He was lynched in 1924. So that's what we've been working on marker-wise. After that Samuel Smith marker, the very likely trajectory is that we're going to start working back in phase 2. So kind of interesting story about phase 2. Phase 2 is more of our North Nashville wing. We know of an unknown man, he's not named, that was lynched in 1877. And then Cordy Cheek was actually lynched in Maury County, but was abducted from Fisk University. And the significance of Cordy Cheek for us is that this was Cordy Cheek, Jackson, where Jackson Street sits, is a little bit closer to where, in particular, Daniel Hambrick lost his life. So that's something that our youth interns did. I have had opportunity now to power youth interns the last several summers. And so one of their projects has been to overlay a map of police or violence with a map of lynchings. And that's something we hope to publish on our website. But Courtney Cheek was abducted miles, even if that, away from where Daniel Hambrick was murdered, right? And so because we are an organization that values place, because we are an organization that values memory, one of the things I've spent a lot of time thinking about is how do we draw the through lines here? Because so often we're talking about, and this was something that when I first started We Remember was incredibly difficult for me, is that one, I'm a self-taught historian, and two, I am young and Black and woman, and a lot of the historians that I was in the room with were not that. And historians want to talk to me about past. They want to talk to me about civil rights movement. They want to talk to me about enslavement, and I'm with that. I am. I was talking at the School World Forum, which is this intergenerational leadership conference several years ago, and I was like, look, I know Panthers. Like, the reality of my life is that I know Panthers, and I know folks who sat at Woolworth and desegregated lunch counters, and I know folks who were at the Dakota Pipeline, and I was with people as we protested police brutality. I worked on the clemency campaign for Centoya Brown, and so on a given day, all these realities are present in my life. And what I hope to do in our work is like to bring all those people to the table. And so it was incredibly difficult because historians wanted to talk to me about 1960, and other folks wanted to talk to me about 2019. And I'm like, we got to talk about both. These things are not disconnected. So David Jones, Joe Reed, kind of happened pretty close together, right? We're looking at, and I don't know, I'm not gonna make any assumptions about what you know about lynching, but the way that I find helpful to bucket history, and different people have different markers. 1619, right? The arrival of Afro-diaspora people on the continent, and not even date-wise. I don't think it's even helpful. What I would say is enslavement, right? Post-enslavement, like emancipation through Reconstruction, is when we see an uptick, right? Then we see the Civil Rights Movement, and then I like to bucket post-Civil Rights Movement through current movement. Those are my brackets, and those brackets are informed by my public work and my professional work, but also just my lived experiences, okay? So we see David Jones, Joe Reed, and I'm going to show you some primary sources on them in particular. And then Henry and Ephraim Grizzard, who are brothers, at the Woodland Street Bridge. Then we have some unknown men. So primarily, we have resources on two of them. The one that's at Fifth Avenue and Monroe Street, which is, if you're familiar to, I'm gonna show you a map, but if you know where the Kroger is on Jefferson Street, not far from there. And then Courtney Cheek, who, like I said, was lynched in Murray County, but we feel like it's important to name that the violence started, and his abduction was in Davidson County proper.
What, was he a descendant of the Cheek family that had the Maxwell house that came from Kentucky?
I'm not sure about that.
Check that out, because the Cheeks that built the Maxwell house when it was downtown, they were from Burkesville, Kentucky.
Okay. And then Bellevue, which that is in phase 3. I won't talk about why, but it is there. Another unknown man. We don't know where exact in Bellevue. We've got people working on that. We thought we had a location, but it's really hard because you're taking all these primary, I know you wanted me to talk about the difficulties. One of them is like, Nashville's changed a lot, and a lot of times we have newspaper clippings and our team is having to like really sift through these documents, and even the locations in the documents are not always exact. The Samuel Smith tree we had a general location, and then, like I said, literally like found out the specific tree because people are still alive that can tell you. I kid you not, it was mind blowing. I took my phone out and started to record because she was like, someone was driving down, was like, I'm going to the grocery store. We're out talking to the arborist because we're talking about like what we're gonna do with this tree because it's not gonna stay up forever. I'm actually probably gonna drive out there tomorrow because I'm thinking about the wind we just had as I'm thinking through this. So we knew that it was 200 meters from the county line, And so we're like out there with the measuring in a truck, and then this woman pulls up. So yeah, 1924. So yeah, those are the ones. And then big important thing for us, because we were like, we know that there are more, and even though we weren't able to like confirm, and we're still working on that, we're going to put an interpretive marker up for all the unnamed victims of lynching, because that's important for us to name. And we're eventually hoping to bring our EGI monument. They have duplicates, and that's the last phase of our project. And so it will be to put up an interpretive sign and that marker to say, these are the names we do know, and these are the names that we don't know. So yeah, and you see that I don't know if you all have been to the Smithsonian, and I think EJI does a phenomenal job of lifting the names we know and the names we don't. But that was really important to us, because we know that there's so many we don't know. So that's like how the nitty gritty of like how we hope it looks. It hasn't gone as planned. It never does.
On this day in 1865, enslaved African Americans were notified of their freedom. Now, this day is known as Juneteenth to celebrate the end of slavery in the U.S. News Channel 5's Brandon Marshall is downtown, where 2 historical markers were unveiled just today. And Brandon, tell us about them.
Rory, we know the markers tell the stories about why 4 men were lynched in Davidson County during the late 1800s. I'm near First Avenue North and Bank Street, where this marker shares the story of David Jones and Joe Reed, 2 African Americans who were pulled from the county jail, shot, and hanged. The coalition We Remember Nashville put on the unveiling to remind folks of the past and also to encourage social justice action for all people. City leaders, including Mayor David Briley, and the public listened to those stories. One organizer says there was a purpose to unveil the markers on Juneteenth.
Juneteenth is a very symbolic of our freedom and of our emancipation. And so part of our work is doing this work in a way that is healing and in a work that tells the full story about Black people, and not just the terror, but also holding space for that terror and that memory.
Coming up at 6, we'll tell you where the second marker is located and tell you the story of the 2 brothers Henry and Ephraim Grizzard. Live downtown in Nashville, Brandon Marshall, News Channel 5.
All right, so I've got some primary source documents, and I'll share links that you can send out so that you can see these better. So even the headlines are always daunting. Like this one for David Jones is mob violence. And the headline is, a Negro taken from the county jail by a mob, twice shot, and hung to a lamppost on the public square. The jail forcibly entered, I was like forcibly. Forcibly entered, and the Negro shot in his cell. The sheriff, resisting the hanging, is knocked down and dragged out. 6 policemen gallantly dispersed the mob and cut down the suspended Negro. Which is interesting, right? I won't say anything. But this one right here, intense excitement in the city last night. And it talks about how you mentioned the Maxwell House. No, you didn't. You mentioned, I think you mentioned the Maxwell House. But anyway, it talks about just kind of how the mob formed. The Banner, which is coming back, but like talks about the Banner reporter. So that's what this is detailing here. And just kind of how it appears that the leaders of the mob, whoever they were, had determined to act speedily and before steps could be taken by the authorities to prevent them. And then here on the right, we're talking about Joe Reed, who was also taken from the jail. And as I mentioned earlier, the Woodland Street Bridge that we know was a suspension bridge. He was 30, Joe Reed was 30, and so his is a little more narrative in terms of the primary source here. It's just a little bit more of a narrative. He was a native Tennessean, and That's all I'll highlight there. So I just kind of wanted to, and I'll talk more about their stories in a second. In terms of Ephraim and Henry Grizzard, which is our second marker, they were brothers, and these are two different primary sources. The first one is from the Nashville Daily American, which was in May 1st of 1892, and the other one was they're actually from the same source, just different dates. So the middle and the bottom one were from a few days earlier. And you can see these different headlines, right? Vengeance, taken from the jail, hanged off the bridge, mob reopens operations in broad daylight, right? And they meet practically no resistance. Negro ex-convict hanged by judge and lynch. So just even thinking about the one about the ex-convict, right, is I think a lot about media and how the media portrays victims of police violence, right? And we see the same thing, right, that this man that's lost his life is not a human being who had a family and a life and a livelihood, but is an ex-convict. Yeah, we haven't located. I think that we might know where that someone on our team might have information about where the Grizzards are. And it's very likely that there's still some. Because another thing is like family contact is something we've grappled with, and a lot of times the families don't want to have anything to do with the work, and we respect that. But yeah, I think we know the Grizzards, where the Grizzard brothers are, and they still have descendants in the city. And so we extend invitations, like when we're focusing on a particular lynching, we extend invitations to the families, and then we let them make the decision. These move into the North Nashville lynchings here. And the North Nashville lynchings, we have less information on, with the exception of Cordy Cheek, who wasn't actually lynched there in North Nashville. But the unknown man was accused of burglary, like of breaking into a house. And very often there are these like crimes that these victims of lynching are accused of. But even in this media, we see there will probably be fewer burglaries in North Nashville hereafter. The citizens have taken matters in their own hands, and last night they put in their first work with terrible effect. They lynched him and drowned him. Because they're saying it's a hoax, right? And that was also common, right, in this reporting, right? And so I show this for two reasons. One, I want to show you some of the primary source documents. If you're interested in more detailed primary source documents, I'm happy to send that to you, if that's your jam. But also just to show you like the media and like the difficulty of this work. Memory is work, right? Like it's intellectual, spiritual, whatever work, but it's also like actually work. Because when you think you might have a lead on something, and then you see something else, and you're like, okay, this is and then is the source reputable? These sources here are relative to Cordy Cheek, who was, like I said, abducted from near Fisk University. They had accused him of assaulting or attacking a girl in like Columbia, Murray County. He was 19, 20, I think by the time that he was 19, he was around 19 or 20. Um, so we know at least 200 people were a part of that, and those are the ones that are named, right, or accounted for. And so he was actually hanged in Colombia. And he did not end up, he was not, let's see here. The grand jury, this is right here saying the cheat case failed. So nothing happened, right? There were 6 that had been named, and the names these people who are like probably still have descendants here, and nothing happened, right? So it wasn't also like, I think it's important to say with the Cheek story in particular, like it was also not men in hoods always, or I don't even know if ever. Like sometimes that's the disillusionment of the terror of racism in all its forms, is like that these people, we don't know who did it. And it's like, actually, we do. Yeah. 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 This is moving more into the Bellevue lynching of an unknown man who they called a Negro ravisher. But we still don't have, we have, that's, as you can see, it's kind of just very vague there. We know it was in Bellevue, but what does that even mean? A posse started in pursuit and reported that the ravisher was caught and hanged to a tree, and the body after it cremated. Samuel Smith, which is the one we're working on in Nolensville. Was 15. And the extent of the violence is also like that they hung and shot, and a lot of times it wasn't just one atrocious act of violence on a body, or a person. And like I said, we think we have the exact location for Samuel Smith, but it's talking about kind of the backstory. That's another thing too, is like a lot of times there's a lot of talk about what people were doing to be lynched, right? And as the founder of We Remember Nashville, just speaking for Brittany, like I'm generally uninterested in what any human being was doing before their mob lynching that would have justified it. There's not anything anyone can say to me that would justify it. But a lot of, and then we see a little bit more about F. Grizzard, which is just Ephraim Grizzard. And this here is about the 200 yards on the side of the Williamson County line, near the vicinity of Nolensville. And it talks about, note that it talks about the charges for Samuel Smith, right? But nothing about what happened to the people who actually incited this, the posse who incited this violence, right? It's a lot about why Samuel Smith was charged with charges of attempted murder. So yeah, just wanted to share those. Here's a little bit of a map, and this is not a map we have publicized, but we just kind of put for record, like the Woodland Street Bridge, where we know near the site of Henry Ephraim Grizzard, Joe Reed. And then we have our North Nashville, which is, these are our proposed markers right here, some of our markers. So like this lynching in North Nashville occurred here. The unknown man, we're not talking about Cordy Cheek, we're talking about the unknown man. And then we're talking about Samuel Smith Cordy was abducted from here. So that's like Fisk area. And then this is the unknown man on 5th and Monroe. This right here is the unknown man in Bellevue. We think that this is we're close to the location. Just from looking at old Bellevue maps and kind of where the center of, because a lot of times these lynchings were done in the center of public life. And so, like, we think we're close. Samuel Smith. County jail is under, there's a blue dot. Yep, there's a blue dot under this. So it wasn't far, it was, I hate to use the word convenient, but like in the case of in the case of Samuel Smith and Henry and Ephraim Grizzard, the suspension bridge was only feet away from the county jail. And as you're seeing, like they're claiming that the sheriff and the personnel had no control of these people coming in, right, and doing this. Neither here nor there. So I just put this up. This is like an internal thing we use to kind of guide us. We have I don't know if you're familiar with Nashville Sites, but it's a free application website that you can do walking tours on. And so our markers that are on off Woodland Street near Bank Street are on there's a racial, I can't remember the name of it, but there's one of them that our marker is on. So if you do that walking tour, it's our hope to have once we have all of our sites, to have some type of accompaniment that you could have as you go from site to site. All right. I'm coming up on 8 o'clock, so I'm gonna talk a little fast here. Not fast, but expedited. So David Jones, like this is, so what we release, marker text just contextually, which I encourage you to go out to our markers. They're beautiful, and I try to walk them once a month, twice every 2 months, just to make sure no one has touched them or vandalized them. We do a couple things when we think about this narrative, and one of those is to make sure we have a forward-facing narrative in addition to the marker language. You can't fit everything on a marker, so it's like certain stuff we want to be consistent. So on the first side of all of our markers, you will see lynching, their standard. You'll see this. So it just says lynching in America, and this is like EJI language, but a couple notes. And we will have a combination of city markers and a combination of EJI markers. But on the EJI markers, you see our Davidson County Community Remembrance Project. I think we're the largest metropolitan city to have a Community Remembrance Project, so I'm proud of that. And then you see this language on the back is our language. So this is standard. And if you were to go to another coalition that had markers, you see the standard language. And then we have the stories on the back. In addition to the stories, though, we like to put out a digestible biography but we only release those once we have the marker up. And so that's what I have included. So for David Jones, this was his abbreviated biography or narrative. And we try not to be inflammatory in our language. But we also try to tell the truth. And so that's how we approach this. So this is David Jones's, and we just talk about he was killed in public square. He was killed on Monday, March 25th, and that he had been accused of murdering a prominent local citizen on Sunday morning. The reason we include that is to just think about the timeline, to think about the justice he was not served, all the many contradictions. And talks about the white mob. They took Mr. Jones, they carried him to the public square, hung him from a lamp post, shot him twice. They cut him down. They returned him to his jail, returned him to the jail to treat his wounds. And he died a few hours later, so he didn't die instantaneously. 400 to 500 people, according to the Nashville Banner, were there. And there was no investigation into the identities of the killers, and no one was held accountable. Joe Reed, April 30th of 1875, hung from the suspension bridge. He had been arrested the same morning. They said that he had shot and killed a white police officer. While in jail, the same thing, mob gathered outside, stormed the jail, broke in, facing very little resistance from the guards. Were able to take Mr. Reed, hung him over the side of the bridge, shot him twice, and then he dropped to the bank below and rolled into the water. This was one of the reasons why it was important for us to be able to see the water from the marker. And basically they said rumors went around that he had survived, but his family never really believed that. Once again, no one was ever charged or convicted of any crime related to the murder, so not even the abduction. April 30th, 1892, over 1,000 people entered the jail. That's not to include the people that watched. They used a sledgehammer and dragged him to the Woodland Street Bridge. They hung him and they shot him over 50 times. Does that sound familiar?
What was the population in 1892?
You know, I don't know. I don't actually know. I'd have to look at the census. But that's a huge, I mean, even with the population of a city today's size, 1,000 people, yeah.
But you also got to know they wasn't just adults, they brought their children.
Mm-hmm.
So that the number was never counted with this minimum. No different than when you look at the Bible, they say things like 5,000 were fed. They never count the women and the children.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, if there's 5,000, maybe 10.
Yeah.
So you keep that in mind that they would never share that.
Yeah. Right. And what's interesting about this, like you said, this is the mob that went into the jail, and so like I can assume that the women and children may or may not have gone. You know, I don't know that the women and children went into the jail. Were they waiting? Like, were there picnics? Like, what was, yeah.
Just a note, but picnics at that time were. Notice you said it was a Sunday.
Oh no, I offer that as a question. Yes.
Families would go to church. Right then thereafter, they've gathered their food together, and they will go and have a picnic. And literally, the picnic was to pick a nigger, and I don't want to be too racist. It was an expression at the time, and that would be a feature event that all families would get involved. And here's what's so keen about this, and I don't want to interrupt anything neither, but the strongest source for people to understand and to be able to jot down a memory is what they were A, told, B, they were read, C, they saw. So much to the ignorance, you've never seen this, didn't hear about it. If you did hear, it was hidden, and there's absolutely no book that would tell you this. How are there even news in this century that are telling you some things that you, I'm sure, have found and discovered today? And if it is discovered or shown, it's very quick and short, and never to the length to let you walk away with a memory and an understanding.
Yeah, right. And so that's why I say I offer that as a question, but it's very probable that people were waiting to watch it. You know, these things became postcards. What's interesting is that the jury for the Grizzards there were people in the mob that were also on the jury. And they stated basically that he'd been killed by unknown people that were not known. And yeah, his body was burned, and no arrests were made. So the question I leave you with is the one I ask myself every day: what do memory and movement have to do with each other? I say everything. I also offer this, right? So this is Jaquez Clemens on the left, and then Daniel Hambrick on the right. This is a picture. Ignore that, me, but Richard Lillard is also a man that was beaten to death by the Nashville police in 1958. And EJI a few years ago invited community partners to come and they have a new memorial that, well, was new at the time, that names like Emmett Till, people who were not lynched, but who were suffered racial terror in other forms. And so Richard Lillard, I laid the rose for his, when they dedicated it. Yeah, I'll leave you with that. I would say two things, and in closing. The first is that just an invitation. We are getting ready to launch some exciting things or things I hope that are exciting. One of which is a co-generational journey back to the National War for Peace and Justice. That'll happen late summer, early fall. Would love for you to be a part of that with We Remember Nashville. But we're getting ready to have a relaunch party, and so I wanted to extend, we haven't even publicized this on our social media yet. I wanted to extend the invitation to you all. So if you want to scan this QR code, also is there. Do you have the people that are here on the email list at all, or? No. Okay, I will send this also to, yeah, so I'll send this invitation. Make sure you have the link. It is a free event, but we're going to relaunch, talk about our new projects. We'll have some stuff in the spring coming up. And we'd love to have you there. But the relaunch is going to be a great time. It's going to be just down the road at Otter Creek West End, which is the old West End Church of Christ. And we're going to have my friend Patrick Chappelle, who runs a podcast and who's actually the pastor there, will be interviewing me, and we'll be talking about kind of where the work is going and where the work has been. And we'll have some exciting updates and some surprises. So would love, if you're local or not local to Nashville, would love to invite you to come, meet our board members, and get involved in the rest of our work. The best place to stay up to date with us is on our website. It's just weremembernashville.org. You can always email info@weremembernashville.org, and it'll come to, if it doesn't come to me, it'll come to someone who will make sure I see it. But thank you for listening. I'll turn it back over to you.